For 15 years, my husband handled the money. He called it protecting me from the stress. The day he left, I discovered he was protecting me from the truth. We were bankrupt. I remember standing in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd organized with color-coded labels and perfect symmetry, holding a stack of envelopes that had just arrived in the mail. Red envelopes, most of them. Final notices, collection warnings, statements from credit cards I didn't know we had, and a letter from our mortgage company informing me that we were 4 months behind on payments, and foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. I sat down at my kitchen table, the one I'd refinished myself 3 years ago, and I tried to understand how this had happened. How had I been so blind? How had I lived in this house, spent money from joint accounts, signed tax returns, and never known that we were drowning in debt? But I knew the answer. I'd trusted Ethan. I'd believed him when he said he was handling everything. I'd been grateful, actually grateful, that he was willing to deal with all that boring financial stuff so I could focus on my work and our home and all the things I was actually good at managing. Ethan had left 3 weeks earlier, just packed a bag and announced he was moving in with Crystal, a 28-year-old woman he'd met at his yoga studio. He was 45, having what he called awakening, deciding he needed to live more authentically, follow his bliss, weighed down by conventional expectations. All the cliché midlife crisis language, delivered with complete sincerity, as if he'd invented these concepts himself. I'd been hurt, humiliated, angry, but I'd also been relieved in a strange way. Our marriage had been hollow for years, though I'd been too busy keeping everything else in order to fully acknowledge it. Ethan was charming and fun and creative, the spontaneous free spirit to my organized planner. That had been attractive when we were in our 20s, opposites attracting and all that. But by our 40s, it just meant I did all the actual work of maintaining our life, while he pursued whatever whim struck him at the moment. So when he left, part of me thought, fine, good. I'll be better off alone anyway. I can organize my life exactly the way I want it. I won't have to accommodate his chaos anymore. I'll be free. But freedom, I was learning, came with a price tag I couldn't afford to pay. That first day, sitting with those red envelopes spread across my kitchen table, I couldn't process the magnitude of what I was looking at. The numbers felt abstract, impossible, like they belonged to someone else's life. Surely there was a mistake. Surely Ethan hadn't actually accumulated over $120,000 in debt without telling me. Surely I hadn't been signing joint tax returns and living in complete ignorance of our financial reality. But there was no mistake. Every envelope, every statement, every collection notice was real, and they were all addressed to both of us. Joint accounts, joint debt, joint responsibility. Even though I'd never seen these credit cards, never spent money on these accounts, never agreed to these loans, I was legally responsible for half of everything. More than half, actually, since Ethan had already made it clear he couldn't contribute to paying any of it off. He was starting over, living simply with Crystal in her studio apartment, working part-time at the yoga studio, finding himself. I was alone with 6 figures of debt and no idea how to handle it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started Googling how to deal with debt. What happens when you can't pay your mortgage? How to declare bankruptcy. Every search led to more terrifying information. Foreclosure processes, credit score destruction, collections, court judgments, a whole world of financial disaster I'd never had to think about before. I'd always been proud of my organizational skills. I ran a successful professional organizing business, helping overwhelmed people take control of their chaotic homes and schedules. I could walk into any cluttered space and immediately see the systems that needed to be implemented, the logical structure that would bring order from chaos. I could create filing systems and schedules and routines that transformed people's lives. But apparently, I couldn't see the chaos in my own financial house. I couldn't organize what I'd never looked at. I'm mourning I'd moved from shock to something else. Not quite panic, but close. A kind of desperate determination. I had to figure this out. I had to take control. I had no choice. I couldn't pay someone else to fix this for me. I didn't have the money for that. I had to learn, somehow, to manage finances myself. I started by making a list. That's what I always did when faced with a problem. Make a list. Break it down into manageable steps. Tackle one thing at a time. My list that first morning had 23 items on it. Call the mortgage company. Call each credit card company. Gather all financial documents. Figure out exactly how much we owe and to whom. Understand our income. Create a budget. Learn what bankruptcy actually means. Research alternatives. Find out what happens to the house. Understand credit scores and how to rebuild them. The list went on and on, each item representing a vast area of ignorance I needed to somehow overcome. I called in sick to work. Then I called in sick for the rest of the week. I couldn't face clients right now, couldn't pretend to have my life together enough to help them organize theirs. I needed to organize my own disaster first. The first phone calls were humiliating. Each customer service representative I spoke to seemed to know more about my financial situation than I did. They could see payment histories I'd never looked at, spending patterns I'd never monitored, missed payment notices I'd never received because Ethan had intercepted the mail. They spoke in jargon I didn't understand: APR, minimum payments, settlement offers, charge-offs, collection agencies. I felt like an idiot, a child, asking basic questions about concepts everyone else seemed to grasp instinctively. "How did you not know about this account?" one particularly judgmental representative asked me. "You're listed as a joint account holder. You've been receiving statements for 7 years." "My husband handled the finances," I said, my voice small. "I didn't see the statements." "Well, you're responsible for the debt regardless," she said, not unkindly, but without sympathy either. Ignorance isn't a legal defense. After 3 days of phone calls, I had a clearer picture, and it was even worse than I'd initially thought. The total debt was actually $147,000. Some of it was old, some recent. Some was in collections, some still with the original creditors. Some had relatively low interest rates. Some had rates above 25% that were compounding daily. It was a complicated, interwoven mess, and I was responsible for all of it. I also discovered that our bank accounts were nearly empty. Checking had $800. Savings had nothing. Ethan had drained it before he left, transferred $15,000 out the day before he moved out. I'd reported it, but the lawyer I'd consulted said it would be nearly impossible to get back, especially since it had been a joint account, and he was legally entitled to access it. My income from my organizing business was around $4,000 a month. Decent enough when living in a paid-off house, nowhere near sufficient for the situation I was now in. The mortgage alone was $2,200, plus utilities, insurance, food, gas, basic living expenses, plus the minimum payments on all this debt, which added up to almost $3,000 a month. The math didn't work. I was $1,500 short every month, and that was assuming nothing unexpected happened. No car repairs or medical expenses or any of the 100 other things that always came up. I couldn't afford to stay in my house. That was the first reality I had to face. The house I'd loved, the one I'd spent years making perfect, organizing every closet and drawer, painting and decorating until it was exactly what I wanted. I couldn't keep it. even if I could somehow catch up on the back payments. I cried that day, real ugly crying that lasted for hours. Mourning the house, yes, but also mourning my own stupidity. How had I been so naive? How had I lived for 15 years letting someone else handle something so fundamental? How had I been so arrogant about my organizational skills in every other area, but so willfully blind about this one? But crying didn't fix anything. So I dried my tears, made a new pot of coffee, and went back to my laptop. I needed to learn everything from the ground up. I needed to understand finances the way I understood organization systems. I needed to become an expert, or at least competent enough to navigate this mess. I started with the basics: personal finance books from the library, YouTube videos about budgeting, blogs written by people who'd climbed out of debt. I consumed information voraciously, the way I always did when learning something new. I took notes, filled notebooks with concepts and definitions and strategies. Emergency funds, debt snowball versus debt avalanche, fixed versus variable expenses, assets versus liabilities, net worth statements, credit utilization ratios, APR calculations, all the vocabulary of personal finance that I'd somehow lived 42 years without learning. And I created spreadsheets. God, did I create spreadsheets? That was my language, the way I processed information and found control. I made a master debt spreadsheet with every creditor, every balance, every interest rate, every minimum payment. I made an income spreadsheet tracking every dollar I earned. I made an expense spreadsheet categorizing every dollar I spent. I made projection spreadsheets modeling different scenarios. What if I sold the house? What if I didn't? What if I could increase my income? What if I couldn't? The spreadsheets made me feel less powerless. They took the overwhelming chaos and broke it into discrete pieces I could analyze and plan around. They showed me patterns and relationships I couldn't see just looking at a pile of bills. They gave me a sense of control even as everything else felt completely out of control. But even with all my spreadsheets and research and planning, the situation was dire. I needed to make more money, drastically more, and I needed to reduce my expenses, drastically. Those were the only two levers I could pull. I decided to sell the house. It was painful, giving up on it, but keeping it would mean drowning in debt for decades. The house had some equity. Not a lot, because of the home equity loan Ethan had taken out, but enough that selling it would clear the mortgage and maybe give me a tiny cushion. I called a realtor, had the house appraised, put it on the market. Every time someone came through for a showing, I felt like they were judging not just the house, but me, my failure, my situation. It sold faster than expected. Within 3 weeks, a young couple, excited about starting their life together in this house that represented the end of mine. The closing was scheduled for 2 months out, which gave me 60 days to figure out where I was going to live and how I was going to rebuild my life from this rubble. I finally balanced the budget for the first time, every penny accounted for in my spreadsheet. But then a letter arrived from a bank I'd never heard of, and I realized the numbers I had didn't tell the whole story. The letter informed me that I was a co-signer on a personal loan Ethan had taken out 4 years ago, $28,000, now in default. The bank was pursuing legal action to recover the funds, and as co-signer, I was fully responsible. I remembered signing something years ago, Ethan saying it was just a formality for a business loan he was getting, something about his freelance photography work. I'd signed without reading it because I trusted him, because he handled the finances, because I never thought to question it. I called Ethan for the first time since he'd left. He was at a sound bath meditation when I reached him. Could I call back later? No, I said. No, I could not call back later. We needed to talk now. About the $175,000 in debt he'd left me with. The number had grown again with this new discovery. "Look, Clara," he said, his voice taking on that patient, condescending tone he always used when explaining why his way of doing things was actually more enlightened than mine. "I didn't leave you with anything. That's our debt, jointly. I'm equally responsible." "Except you don't have any assets," I said. "You've already told me you can't contribute to paying it. You're living in Crystal's studio making $12 an hour teaching yoga. You have nothing they can take. I'm the one with the house, with the business, with anything worth going after. I'm the one who's going to bear the consequences of this." "That's very victim mentality thinking, Clara. You're choosing to see this as a negative." I hung up on him. I'd learned something important in that moment. Ethan wasn't going to help. Ethan wasn't going to take responsibility. Ethan was going to continue living his authentic, unencumbered life while I dealt with the mess. Expecting anything else from him was a waste of energy I didn't have. So I stopped expecting. I stopped hoping he'd have a moment of clarity and step up. I stopped thinking about fairness or what he should do. I focused only on what I could control, which was my own response to this situation. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in a less desirable part of town. Rent was $800 a month, less than half what my mortgage had been. It was one room, basically, with a kitchenette and a bathroom that had seen better decades. The building was old and loud, neighbors arguing through thin walls, sirens at all hours. It was the opposite of my beautiful, organized house, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered now. I sold furniture I couldn't fit in the studio. I sold my car and bought a used one for cash, old and ugly, but functional. I canceled every subscription and service I'd been paying for. No more streaming services, gym membership, meal delivery, wine club, monthly flower delivery, all the small luxuries that had seemed so reasonable when I thought we could afford them. I cut my expenses down to absolute basics: rent, utilities, phone, internet, food, gas. That was it. And I worked. God, did I work. I took on every organizing client I could find. I raised my rates, figuring I had nothing to lose. I expanded my services, offering virtual organizing consultations to clients outside my area. I created an online course about organizing, selling it for $97 to people I'd never meet. I wrote organizing articles for websites that paid $50 each. I did anything and everything I could think of to increase my income. Within 2 months, I was making $6,500 a month. Still not enough to aggressively pay down the debt, but enough to cover my reduced living expenses and start making real progress on the minimum payments. More importantly, I wasn't falling further behind. The hole had stopped getting deeper. I created what I called my debt destruction plan. Every creditor listed, every balance, prioritized by a combination of interest rate and balance. I'd pay minimums on everything, then throw every extra dollar at whichever debt was at the top of my priority list. Once that was paid off, I'd move to the next one and the next, creating a snowball effect that would eventually clear everything. On paper, it would take me 7 years to pay off everything. 7 years of living in that tiny apartment, working constantly, having no life outside of earning money and paying debt. 7 years of sacrifice. But 7 years would pass regardless. I could spend them drowning in debt or climbing out of it. The choice was mine. 6 months in, I paid off my first credit card. It was only $3,200, the smallest balance. But seeing that zero balance felt like a victory more significant than anything I'd achieved professionally. I'd done that. Me, Clara, who'd been completely financially illiterate 6 months earlier. I'd educated myself and created a system and executed it and eliminated an entire debt. It was proof that I could do this, that I wasn't helpless, that I was capable of learning and growing and taking control. I celebrated by buying myself a fancy coffee, a $4 extravagance I normally denied myself. And I updated my spreadsheet, moving the payment I'd been making on that card to the next debt on my list. The snowball was rolling. The learning curve was steep and sometimes painful. I made mistakes, lots of them. I missed a payment once because I'd confused the due date, resulting in a late fee and a hit to my credit score. I accidentally overdrew my checking account, triggering a $35 fee that made me want to cry. I got scammed by a debt consolidation company that promised to settle my debts for pennies on the dollar, losing $500 before realizing it was a fraud. Each mistake taught me something, added to my growing financial literacy, made me more cautious and informed. I also discovered resources I hadn't known existed. Nonprofit credit counseling services that offered free advice and debt management plans. Online communities of people in similar situations, sharing strategies and encouragement. Library books about behavioral economics and the psychology of money. Podcasts hosted by financial experts who made complex topics accessible. I absorbed it all, my ignorance slowly transforming into knowledge. 1 year after Ethan left, I'd paid off 3 credit cards and reduced my total debt by $22,000. My credit score, which had been in the low 500s, was back up to 6,040. I was still living in the studio, still working constantly, still sacrificing any kind of social life or leisure. But I was making progress. Real, measurable, undeniable progress. And something unexpected was happening. I was discovering that I liked this. Not the debt or the stress or the tiny apartment, but the process. The learning, the planning, the executing, the seeing results from my efforts. I liked understanding money in a way I never had before. I liked knowing exactly where every dollar was going. I liked the feeling of competence and control that came from managing my finances successfully. I started to see parallels between financial organization and the physical organization I helped clients achieve. Both required honest assessment of the current situation, however painful that was. Both required clear goals and realistic plans. Both required systems that were sustainable rather than perfect. Both required addressing the underlying behaviors and beliefs that had created the chaos in the first place. I'd spent 15 years helping people organize their physical spaces, but had never applied those same principles to my financial life. Now I was discovering capabilities I'd never known I had. Around the 18-month mark, something shifted. A client mentioned she wished someone could help her organize her finances the way I'd organized her home. A light bulb went off in my head. Why wasn't I offering that? I had expertise now, real expertise, born from desperate necessity, but expertise nonetheless. I knew how to create financial systems. I knew how to track spending and build budgets and plan debt payoff. I knew how to take overwhelming chaos and break it into manageable steps. I created a new service, financial organizing. Not financial advising. I wasn't qualified for that, and made it clear I wasn't giving investment advice or anything requiring certification. But organizing, that I could do. I could help people gather their financial documents, create systems for tracking bills and expenses, build realistic budgets, organize their financial lives the way I'd organized my own. My first financial organizing client was a divorced woman in her 50s who'd also never handled money during her marriage. I helped her understand her situation, create a filing system for her documents, set up a budgeting spreadsheet, establish automatic payments for her bills. She cried when I left, said I'd changed her life, given her confidence she didn't know she could have. She paid me $200 for 4 hours of work. Word spread. More clients wanted this service. Within 3 months, financial organizing was half my business. Within 6 months, it was 3/4. I was making more money than I ever had, helping people with a problem I deeply understood because I'd lived it myself. My own disaster had become my expertise. By year 2, I'd paid off over $50,000 in debt. Half my credit cards were cleared. The personal loan was almost done. I'd increased my income to $9,500 a month. I'd moved to a slightly bigger apartment, still modest but no longer depressing. I had an emergency fund, an actual emergency fund of $3,000 that sat in a high-yield savings account and wasn't to be touched unless absolutely necessary. I barely recognized my life compared to 2 years earlier. Or maybe I barely recognized myself. The woman who'd sat at her kitchen table holding those red envelopes, paralyzed by ignorance and fear, was gone. In her place was someone competent and knowledgeable and, dare I say it, confident about finances. People started asking me to speak about my experience. A local women's group invited me to give a talk about rebuilding after financial disaster. A library asked me to lead a workshop on budgeting basics. A podcast about divorce recovery wanted to interview me about the financial aspects of splitting up. Each time, I shared what I'd learned, the mistakes I'd made, the systems that had worked, the mindset shifts that had been necessary. And each time, I met more people who were where I'd been, overwhelmed, scared, feeling stupid about not understanding finances, not knowing where to start. I could help them now. I could give them the roadmap I'd had to create from scratch. That felt meaningful in a way my original organizing business never quite had. I was solving a problem I genuinely understood from painful personal experience. 3 years after the divorce, I paid off the last of the credit card debt. The big debts remained: the personal loan and some medical bills and the student loan debt. But the credit cards were done. $87,000 paid off in 3 years. It had required every ounce of discipline and sacrifice I possessed, but I'd done it. I celebrated this time with more than just coffee. I took a day off, my first full day off in 3 years, and went hiking in the mountains. I sat at the summit, looking at the view, and thought about how far I'd climbed, metaphorically speaking, from complete financial ignorance to being someone who now taught others about money management, from drowning in debt to being halfway free of it, from feeling powerless and dependent to feeling capable and independent. The process had changed me in ways that went beyond just finances. I was more confident in general, more willing to tackle things I didn't know how to do, more comfortable with the discomfort of being a beginner. I'd learned that ignorance isn't permanent, that you can educate yourself about anything if you're motivated enough. I'd learned that shame about not knowing something is less useful than curiosity about learning it. I'd learned that I was more resilient and capable than I'd ever believed. I'd also learned some hard truths about my marriage. Ethan hadn't been protecting me from stress by handling the finances. He'd been protecting himself from accountability. He'd been hiding his overspending, his financial irresponsibility, his inability to live within means. And I'd enabled that by being willfully ignorant, by being happy to let someone else handle something I found boring and difficult. We'd both failed, in different ways. Him by being reckless and dishonest, me by being passive and disengaged. The debt was his fault in terms of who spent the money, but it was our shared fault in terms of the dynamic we'd created where such a situation was possible. I'd learned that I never wanted to be that dependent on anyone again. Not just financially, though certainly that, but dependent in the sense of giving someone else complete control over a fundamental aspect of my life. I wanted to be someone who could handle anything myself, who had all the knowledge and skills necessary to navigate the world independently. That didn't mean I'd never be in a relationship again or never trust anyone, but it meant I never again outsource my own agency to someone else, By year 4, my business had evolved significantly. I'd hired an assistant to handle scheduling and administrative tasks. I'd created several online courses about different aspects of financial organization. I'd written an ebook about recovering from financial disaster. I was making $12,000 a month, more than I'd ever dreamed of making when I was married. I'd also rebuilt my credit score to 720, good enough to qualify for decent interest rates, good enough that the financial destruction of the divorce and debt was no longer defining my financial identity. I'd proven to creditors, and more importantly, to myself, that I was responsible and capable. The remaining debt was down to $38,000. The personal loan, almost done. The medical bills, in a payment plan. The student loan, steadily shrinking. I could see the finish line now. Another 18 months, maybe 2 years, and I'd be completely debt-free. Truly free, with no obligations to anyone, no past mistakes weighing me down. I started thinking about what came next. Once the debt was gone, what would I do with all that money I'd been throwing at payments? Save it, obviously. Build up my emergency fund to 6 months of expenses, then 12. Start investing, making my money work for me instead of just working for money. Maybe buy a small house again, paying cash this time. No mortgage, no risk of losing it if something went wrong. I'd learned to think long-term about money in ways I never had before. To consider not just this month or this year, but decades down the line. Retirement planning, something I'd never thought about during my marriage. Investment strategies, tax optimization. Building wealth slowly and steadily rather than just earning and spending in an endless cycle. I took a financial planning course, then another, then enrolled in a certification program to become a financial coach. Not a financial advisor. That would require different credentials, and I didn't want to manage investments or sell financial products. But a coach who could help people understand their relationship with money, create sustainable systems, develop healthy financial habits. That felt like the natural evolution of what I was already doing. 5 years after Ethan left, I paid off the last of the debt. $175,000 completely eliminated. It had taken every bit of those 5 years, every sacrifice, every extra hour of work, every spending decision made with the debt in mind. But it was done. I was debt-free. At 47 years old, I was completely debt-free with a thriving business and financial literacy I'd never imagined possessing. I'd climbed out of a hole that had seemed bottomless and reached solid ground. The day I made the final payment, I updated my spreadsheet one last time. Every balance showed 0. My net worth, which had been deeply negative 5 years ago, was now positive. Not hugely positive. I wasn't wealthy, but positive. I had more assets than liabilities. I had savings and retirement funds and a business with value. I had financial security that was entirely of my own making. I called my sister, the only family member who'd known the full extent of how bad things had been. I did it, I told her. I paid off everything. I'm free. She cried. I cried. We talked about how terrified I'd been that first year, how many times I'd wanted to give up, how impossible it had seemed. And now it was done. I treated myself to something I'd been waiting 5 years for, a vacation. A real vacation, not a day off to hike local trails, but an actual trip. I went to the coast, rented a small cottage for a week, spent days walking on the beach and reading books, and doing absolutely nothing productive. I could afford it, easily, and I didn't feel guilty about spending the money. That felt like freedom in its own way, spending money on joy rather than survival. On experiences rather than obligations. While I was there, walking on the beach early one morning, I thought about Ethan. I hadn't seen him or spoken to him in years, had no idea what his life looked like now. For a while, I'd been angry at him, furiously angry for the debt and the lies and the devastation he'd left behind. But that anger had faded somewhere along the way, replaced by something more like indifference. He'd done me a terrible, painful favor. By leaving and revealing the financial disaster we were in, he'd forced me to learn and grow in ways I never would have otherwise. I'd become stronger, more capable, more self-reliant. I'd discovered talents and interests I'd never known I had. I built a business I loved and helped hundreds of people improve their lives. None of that would have happened if he'd stayed, if we'd continued in our unsustainable patterns. If I'd remained willfully ignorant about finances, I wouldn't thank him for it. He didn't deserve thanks for his irresponsibility and dishonesty. But I could acknowledge that good had come from bad, that I'd transformed pain into growth, that the worst thing that had happened to me had ultimately made me better. 6 years after the divorce, I bought a house. A small house, 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, in a modest but safe neighborhood. I paid cash for it, the full $215,000, money I'd saved from my business over the previous year. No mortgage, no monthly payment I could lose the house over, no debt of any kind. It was mine, completely and utterly mine. I spent months making it perfect, not for anyone else, not to impress anyone or accommodate anyone's preferences but my own. I painted every room exactly the colors I wanted. I organized every closet and cabinet with systems that made sense to me. I decorated in a style that reflected my taste alone. It was smaller than the house I'd lost, simpler, less impressive from the outside. But it was more precious to me than that other house had ever been, because I'd earned this one myself, paid for it with money from work I loved, secured it with knowledge and skill I'd fought to acquire. My business continued to grow. I was now certified as a financial coach and was working with clients who had complex financial situations, helping them untangle years of chaos and build sustainable systems. I'd written a book about financial organization that had been published by a small press and was selling steadily. I was speaking at conferences and workshops regularly. I'd become, improbably, something of an expert in the field I'd known nothing about 6 years earlier. I started mentoring other women who were going through divorces, specifically around the financial aspects. I'd meet with them, help them understand their situations, teach them how to create budgets and payoff plans, give them the tools and knowledge they needed to take control. I did much of this work for free or sliding scale. Remembering how desperately I'd needed help and how difficult it had been to find someone who understood both the practical and emotional aspects of financial disaster. One woman I mentored said something that stuck with me. "You're teaching me more than just money management," she said. "You're teaching me that I'm capable of learning hard things, of handling what seems impossible. That's going to help me with so much more than just finances." She was right. The financial literacy was important, crucial even. But the deeper lesson was about agency and capability and resilience, about not accepting helplessness, about educating yourself, about taking control of your life in concrete and practical ways. Those lessons transferred to everything. 7 years after Ethan left, I ran into him at a grocery store. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, tired, thinner. He was shopping with Crystal, who also looked different than I'd imagined, more ordinary. They had a baby with them, screaming in the cart. "Clara," he said, looking uncomfortable. "Hi, how are you?" "I'm good," I said. "Really good, actually." We made awkward small talk for a few minutes. He asked if I was still doing organizing. I told him about my business, the coaching, the book. He looked surprised, maybe a little impressed. He told me he'd left the yoga studio, was working in IT now, something about needing steady income with the baby. He didn't mention the debt, didn't ask if I'd managed to handle it, didn't apologize for any of it. After we parted ways, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, at how different our trajectories had been. No desire to tell him off or make sure he knew how well I was doing. Just nothing. He was a stranger I used to be married to, someone who'd accidentally set me on a better path by destroying the old one, but who had no relevance to my current life. That indifference felt like the final step in my recovery. Not just financial recovery, but emotional recovery from the whole experience. I'd processed the anger, learned the lessons, moved on completely. He was part of my past, part of my story, but not part of my present or future. 8 years after the divorce, I hit a milestone I'd been working toward: $100,000 in savings and investments, a 6-figure net worth, positive this time, built entirely by my own efforts. It wasn't wealthy by many standards, but to me, to someone who'd been negative $175,000 8 years earlier, it was extraordinary. I looked at my spreadsheet, the master financial spreadsheet I still maintained and updated regularly, even though there was no debt to track, just growth to monitor. Every number represented a choice I'd made, a sacrifice I'd accepted, work I'd completed, money I'd earned and allocated wisely. Every number was mine. I thought about the woman I'd been at 42, sitting in her kitchen with those red envelopes, completely lost and terrified. If I could talk to her now, what would I say? I'd tell her it's going to be okay. More than okay, actually. She's going to learn and grow in ways she can't imagine. She's going to discover she's capable of so much more than she believes. She's going to become someone she's proud to be, someone who doesn't need anyone else to handle the hard parts of life for her. I'd tell her the next few years are going to be difficult, brutally difficult at times. There will be moments when she wants to give up, when the debt feels insurmountable, when she's so tired of sacrifice and work. But she's going to keep going anyway. And every hard choice, every sacrifice, every hour of learning and working, it's going to be worth it. I'd tell her that the debt isn't going to destroy her. It's going to transform her. It's going to force her to learn the skills and develop the strengths she needs to build a life that's truly hers. It's going to make her independent and capable and confident in ways she's never been. I'd tell her that 8 years from now, she'll own a house free and clear. She'll have a business she loves that helps people every day. She'll have financial security she created herself. She'll have knowledge and skills that will serve her for the rest of her life. She'll have proven to herself that she can handle anything. Most importantly, I tell her that she's going to be happy. Genuinely, deeply happy, in a way she wasn't even in the supposedly good times of her marriage. Because she's going to be living authentically, fully in control of her own life, not dependent on anyone else for her security or identity or worth. But I can't talk to that earlier version of myself. She just has to live through it, day by day, choice by choice, mistake by mistake, victory by victory. She has to learn the lessons the hard way, because that's the only way they really stick. All I can do now is be grateful that she did the work, that she didn't give up, that she chose to learn instead of staying helpless. She gave me this life, this security, this knowledge, this confidence. Everything I have now exists because she was brave enough to start learning when she knew nothing, to keep working when it seemed hopeless, to believe she could become someone different than who she'd been. 9 years after the divorce, I was invited to speak at a financial literacy conference. A real conference with hundreds of attendees held at a convention center in another state. They wanted me to tell my story, to talk about the journey from complete financial ignorance to financial independence. They were paying me $3,000 for a 45-minute talk. I stood on that stage looking out at the audience, mostly women, many of them clearly struggling with their own financial challenges, and I told them the truth. I told them about the red envelopes, about discovering I was deeply in debt at 42, about not knowing what APR meant or how credit cards worked. I told them about the shame and fear and feeling like an idiot. I told them about the tiny apartment and the years of sacrifice and the mistakes I made along the way. But I also told them about the spreadsheets, about the systems I built, about the debt I paid off dollar by dollar. I told them about discovering I was capable of learning hard things, about becoming someone who could handle her own finances competently. I told them about the business I built and the house I bought with cash and the financial security I created from nothing. I told them it was possible, that they could do it too, that financial literacy wasn't some innate skill some people had and others didn't. It was something anyone could learn if they were willing to do the work. When I finished, the applause was overwhelming, but more meaningful were the women who approached me afterward, telling me their own stories. The newly divorced woman who just discovered her ex had destroyed their credit. The widow who'd never handled money during her marriage and was terrified. The young woman who'd grown up in poverty and never learned financial basics. Each of them saw themselves in my story, saw hope that they could transform their own situations. I gave them what I wished someone had given me 8 years earlier: concrete advice, practical steps, realistic timelines, and genuine belief that they could do this. I told them about free resources, about budgeting apps, about nonprofit credit counseling. I told them to start with education, to learn the vocabulary and concepts before trying to make big decisions. I told them to be patient with themselves, that this was a marathon, not a sprint, that mistakes were part of learning. And I told them the most important thing I'd learned, that taking control of your finances is about more than just money. It's about agency and self-determination and refusing to be helpless. It's about believing you're capable of learning and growing and handling hard things. 10 years after Ethan left, I looked at my life with a sense of profound gratitude and accomplishment. I owned my home outright. I had $230,000 in savings and investments. I had a business that generated $15,000 a month consistently. I had financial knowledge that would serve me for the rest of my life. I had helped hundreds of clients take control of their financial lives. I had written a book that continued to help people I'd never meet. I had security and independence I built entirely myself. But more than any of those external markers of success, I had something more precious. I knew myself. I knew what I was capable of. I knew that when life knocked me down, I could get back up. I knew that when faced with something I didn't know how to do, I could learn. I knew that I didn't need anyone else to take care of me or protect me or handle the hard parts for me. I could do it all myself. That didn't mean I wanted to be alone forever or never trust anyone. I dated some over the years, had a few relationships that didn't work out for various reasons. I was open to finding a partner eventually, if the right person came along. But I didn't need a partner. That was the difference. I wanted companionship and love and connection, but I didn't need someone else to be complete or secure or okay. Any future relationship would be built on a foundation of mutual independence rather than dependence. Two whole people choosing to share their lives, not two incomplete people trying to fill each other's gaps. I'd never again be in a relationship where someone else controlled a fundamental aspect of my life. Never again would I abdicate responsibility for my own well-being to someone else. I thought about the question people sometimes ask me: would I go back and do things differently if I could? Would I have insisted on being involved in the finances during my marriage, prevented the debt from accumulating, avoided the whole disaster? Honestly, I didn't know. Part of me said, yes, of course, avoiding the debt and the stress and the years of struggle would have been better. But another part of me recognized that I'd needed that crisis. I'd needed to be forced out of my comfortable ignorance. I'd needed to hit rock bottom to discover what I was capable of building. If Ethan had been responsible with money, if we'd stayed together in our mediocre marriage, I'd probably still be that person who organized other people's closets but couldn't manage her own finances. I'd still be dependent, passive, willfully blind to a crucial aspect of adult life. The disaster had been a harsh teacher, but an effective one. It had given me skills and knowledge and confidence I never would have developed otherwise. It had shown me I was capable of more than I'd believed. It had forced me to become someone stronger and more competent. So no, I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, and I certainly wouldn't choose to go through it again. But I also couldn't wish it hadn't happened, because then I wouldn't be who I am now. I thought about Ethan occasionally, though less and less as time passed. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Crystal had gotten married, had another baby, were struggling financially. He'd changed jobs several times, never quite finding the right fit, never quite managing to get ahead. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy at this news, just that same indifference. He was living his life, making his choices, dealing with his consequences. I was living mine. Had he learned anything from our disaster? Had he developed better financial habits? I had no idea and didn't particularly care. His growth or lack of it wasn't my concern anymore. I'd worked on my own growth, my own learning, my own transformation. That was all I could control. I continued to mentor women going through divorces and financial crises. This work had become one of the most meaningful parts of my life. I saw myself in each of them, remembered so clearly how lost and scared I'd been. I could give them the roadmap I'd had to create from scratch, could save them some of the mistakes I'd made, could offer them hope based on lived experience rather than empty platitudes. One woman I mentored sent me a message 2 years after we'd worked together. "I just made my last debt payment," she wrote. "I'm free, and I wanted to thank you for showing me this was possible. When we first met, I didn't believe I could ever dig myself out. But you'd done it, so I thought maybe I could too. And I did. You changed my life." Messages like that made everything worthwhile. The years of struggle, the sacrifices, the hard work. All of it had meaning beyond just my own survival. It had equipped me to help others survive too. My pain had become my purpose. I also thought about what I'd pass on to young people, the lessons I wished I'd learned at 20 instead of 42. Financial literacy should be taught in schools. I'd become convinced of this. Basic concepts like budgeting, compound interest, the true cost of debt, how credit works, the importance of saving. So many disasters could be prevented if people understood these fundamentals before they were drowning in debt. I'd started volunteering at local high schools, teaching financial literacy workshops. The students were sometimes skeptical, sometimes bored, but occasionally I saw lights go on in their eyes. I'd get through to a few of them, give them tools they'd use for the rest of their lives, maybe save them from the mistakes I'd made. That mattered. I told them, learn this stuff now. Don't wait until you're in crisis. Don't assume someone else will handle it for you. Don't be willfully ignorant about something so fundamental to your security and freedom. Take control of your financial life from the beginning, and you'll have so many more options, so much more freedom, than if you wait until disaster forces you to learn. Some listened. Most probably didn't. Would need to learn the hard way, like I had. But even reaching a few made it worthwhile. 11 years after the divorce, I was truly thriving. My business had expanded to include an online membership community where people paid monthly for ongoing financial organization support and education. I'd hired 2 other financial coaches to work with me. I'd been featured in several major publications. I'd spoken at dozens of conferences and workshops. My book had sold over 50,000 copies. I'd built something substantial and lasting. My net worth had crossed $300,000. I was on track to retire comfortably at 65 if I chose to, though I couldn't imagine actually retiring. I loved my work too much, found too much meaning in it. Maybe I'd slow down eventually, work less, travel more, but stop completely? Unlikely. I'd also finally started dating someone seriously. His name was Michael, a teacher I'd met at one of the high schools where I volunteered. He was 52, divorced, financially responsible, kind and stable, and completely unexcited about spontaneous adventures. In other words, nothing like Ethan. We'd been seeing each other for 8 months, taking things slowly, both of us cautious after our respective divorce experiences. What I appreciated most about Michael was that he respected my independence. He didn't try to take care of me or manage things for me. He didn't suggest combining finances or moving in together or any of the traditional relationship escalations. He had his life, I had mine. We enjoyed spending time together, and that was enough for now. Maybe it would develop into something more serious eventually. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way was okay. I was learning that being in a relationship didn't have to mean losing yourself or giving up control. It could be two independent people choosing to share parts of their lives while maintaining their individual autonomy. That was a healthier model than anything I'd experienced before. For my 53rd birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a huge party, just close friends and my sister and Michael. But I wanted to mark this milestone, this moment of being 53 and financially secure and genuinely happy. I'd come so far from 42 and terrified and buried in debt. I wanted to celebrate that journey, acknowledge what I'd overcome and what I'd built. During the party, my sister pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I know I've said that before, but I need you to know I really mean it. What you did, teaching yourself all of this, paying off all that debt, building this business, it's extraordinary. You should be proud of yourself too." "I am," I said, and realized it was true. For years, I'd felt embarrassed about having been so ignorant, ashamed that I'd let myself be so dependent on Ethan, angry at myself for not seeing the disaster coming. But I'd worked through those feelings in therapy and personal reflection, had come to understand that self-blame wasn't useful. What mattered was what I'd done after discovering the problem, how I'd responded to the crisis, who I'd become through the process. I was proud of that woman, the one who'd panicked initially, but then got to work, the one who'd educated herself from scratch about an entire subject, the one who'd created systems and followed through on plans, even when it was difficult. The one who'd sacrificed and worked and persevered for years to climb out of a hole she hadn't dug herself. The one who'd transformed catastrophe into expertise and then used that expertise to help others. She was someone worth being proud of. 12 years after the divorce, I reached a goal I'd set for myself years earlier: financial independence. Not retirement necessarily, but the point where my investments and passive income could theoretically cover my living expenses indefinitely. I didn't have to work anymore, not financially. I still would, because I loved my work and found meaning in it, but I didn't have to. That freedom was intoxicating. I celebrated by doing something I'd been dreaming about for years, taking a month-long trip to Europe. I'd never been, had never been able to afford it during my marriage or the lean years after. But now I could, easily. I planned the trip myself, researching and booking everything, creating detailed spreadsheets with itineraries and budgets, applying my organizational skills to travel planning. The trip was magical, not just because of the places I saw, though they were beautiful, but because of what it represented. I'd paid for this entire trip with money I'd earned and saved. I'd planned every detail myself. I was traveling alone by choice, not because no one would come with me, but because I wanted the freedom to go where I wanted, spend as long as I wanted in each place, change my plans on a whim if something interested me. I was completely independent, completely self-sufficient, completely free. One evening in Paris, sitting at a cafe watching people walk by, I thought about how impossible this would have seemed 12 years earlier. That woman crying over red envelopes couldn't have imagined traveling to Europe alone, confidently managing foreign currencies and languages and logistics, financially secure enough to take a month off work without anxiety. But here I was, and I'd gotten here not through luck or someone else's help, but through my own effort and learning and persistence. Every skill I'd developed, every lesson I'd learned, every dollar I'd saved, it had all led to this moment, to freedom and security and confidence and joy. I pulled out my phone and took a selfie, something I rarely did. But I wanted to remember this moment, this feeling of being exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do. With no one's permission or approval needed, just me, Clara, 54 years old, financially independent, genuinely happy, living a life I'd built from scratch after disaster. That photo would go on my wall at home, a reminder of what was possible, of how far I'd come, of who I'd become. When I returned from Europe, I made a decision. I was going to write another book, this one more comprehensive than the first. A complete guide to rebuilding your financial life after divorce or other disaster. Everything I'd learned, every system I'd created, every mistake I'd made and lesson I'd extracted from it. I wanted to give other people the resource I wished had existed when I was starting out. Something that covered not just the practical steps, but the emotional journey, the mindset shifts, the whole experience of transformation. It took me 2 years to write. I worked on it in the mornings before my client work, on weekends, during any spare moment I could find. It was comprehensive, detailed, practical. But it was also honest about how hard the journey was, how long it took, how many setbacks I'd faced. I didn't want to offer false hope or suggest this was easy. It wasn't easy, but it was possible, and it was worth it. The book was published by a major publisher this time and became a bestseller in the personal finance category. Not a massive, mainstream bestseller, but successful within its niche. It sold over 100,000 copies in the first year. I got messages daily from readers telling me how the book had helped them, given them hope, provided a roadmap they desperately needed. One message in particular moved me. "I found your book at the library 3 months after my divorce," a woman wrote. "I was where you were at the beginning, completely lost, buried in debt I didn't know existed, terrified I'd never recover. Your book showed me it was possible. You'd done it, so maybe I could too. I'm 1 year in now, following your systems, and I've already paid off $15,000 in debt. I'm going to make it. Thank you for showing me how." That's what I'd hoped for. Not to give people fish, but to teach them to fish. Not to solve their problems for them, but to show them they were capable of solving their problems themselves. To offer both practical tools and belief that change was possible. 14 years after the divorce, I looked at my life with a sense of completion. Not that my life was over or that I had nothing left to achieve, but that I'd completed a journey. From helpless to capable, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from dependent to independent, from victim of circumstance to creator of my own reality. I'd started with nothing but debt and fear. I'd built a life of security and confidence. I'd transformed disaster into opportunity. I'd become someone I admired, someone I was proud to be. And I'd helped countless others do the same. The numbers in my spreadsheets told part of the story. 0 debt, 400,000 in net worth, a thriving business, financial independence. Those were important, tangible markers of progress. But the real transformation wasn't in the numbers. It was in me, in my knowledge and skills and confidence, in my ability to handle whatever life threw at me, in my refusal to be helpless or dependent, in my willingness to learn hard things and do hard things and keep going even when it seemed impossible. For 15 years, my husband handled the money. He called it protecting me from the stress. The day he left, I discovered he was protecting me from the truth. We were bankrupt. But that catastrophic discovery, as painful as it was, set me free. Free from dependence, from ignorance, from the limitations I'd placed on myself. Free to learn and grow and become someone capable of handling anything. Free to build a life that was genuinely mine, not dependent on anyone else's management or permission or approval. I wouldn't wish the experience of discovering you're drowning in debt on anyone. The panic, the shame, the years of struggle, they were genuinely difficult. But I also wouldn't trade who I became through that experience. The capable, confident, financially literate woman I am now only exists because the overwhelmed, ignorant, dependent woman I was then was forced to change. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is also the thing that saves you. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're truly capable of building. Sometimes disaster is the doorway to transformation, if you're brave enough to walk through it and do the work on the other side. I walked through that doorway 14 years ago, terrified and unprepared. But I did the work. I learned the lessons. I built the skills. I created the systems. I paid off the debt dollar by dollar. I transformed myself from someone who needed protecting to someone who could protect herself. And now, looking back from the other side, I can see that those red envelopes, as devastating as they seemed when I first opened them, were actually a gift. A harsh, painful gift that I never would have chosen, but a gift nonetheless. They showed me I was capable of more than I'd believed. They forced me to become someone I'm proud to be. They gave me purpose and meaning and the ability to help others through their own financial disasters. For 15 years, someone else handled my money. For the past 14 years, I've handled it myself. And these 14 years, difficult as they sometimes were, have been infinitely better than those 15 years of comfortable ignorance. Because I did them. I lived them actively, consciously, competently. I was the author of my own story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. That, more than any amount of money I've saved or debt I've paid off, is what true financial independence means. Not just having enough money, but having enough knowledge and skill and confidence to handle your own life. To be your own protector, your own manager, your own authority. I didn't know I was capable of that when I started, but I learned, and if I could learn it, starting from complete ignorance at 42, anyone can. That's what I want people to know. That's the message I try to share in my work, in my speaking, in my books, in my mentoring. You are capable. You can learn this. You can handle your own finances, no matter how overwhelming they seem right now. You can transform disaster into empowerment. You can become someone who doesn't need anyone else to protect them from the truth, because you're strong enough to face the truth yourself and deal with it. It won't be easy. It will take time and effort and sacrifice. You'll make mistakes and have setbacks and want to give up sometimes. But if you keep going, if you do the work of educating yourself and creating systems and following through, you will get there. You will reach security and independence and confidence. You will become someone you're proud to be. I know, because I did it. And if I can do it, so can you.